Hi, welcome to our presentation on the experimental security analysis of a modern automobile by Jay and Matt. My name is Jay and I'll be taking you through the first half of the presentation. For the most part of the 20th century, cars were mainly mechanical objects. They had a simple system of a fuel injector and a wheel and some wheels, and that pretty much drove the entire car. By 1998, Volkswagen introduced the first onboard computer, basically to monitor the real-time tuning of its fuel injection systems. California in 1996 introduced the first OBD port, or onboard diagnostics port, to monitor all these electronic systems. Nowadays, however, we have hundreds of electronic components in our cars, as you can see by the image on the right. We have driver alertness monitoring, heads-up display, night vision, windshield wiper and control, etc., etc. We've also had several proposals to develop app stores for cars, as you can see Apple Play and Android Auto, so that people can install applications and have them run on their car systems. So what are the problems with introducing computers to a vehicle? Well, on the benefits side, vehicle efficiency improved and the safety of cars also improved dramatically. But on the downside, it also introduced potential vulnerabilities. Now, previous researchers had looked at the control area network protocol because that was what it was used to communicate between the interconnected components in a car, and they highlighted four key aspects of it here. Broadcast by nature, fragility to denial of service, no authentication field, and weak access control. The CAN protocol was broadcast by nature, so whatever packets were sent on its bus were picked up by whatever components needed to read it. Secondly, so obviously this presented a security challenge because if you could inject malicious packets, all the components would be reading it. Secondly, it was fragile to denial of service because the CAN bus protocol was designed so it had two priorities, a high priority packet and a low priority packet. And so if you continuously sent out high priority packets, the low priority packets would never ever be read by the system. Thirdly, there was no authenticator field, so the nodes that were the components that were listening on the bus had no idea who was sending what, and there was no way of verifying any of this as well. Lastly, there was weak access control. By weak access control, we mean that if you were going to upgrade the firmware, several challenges would be sent through to make sure that everything was okay and verifiable. The problem is that the keys that were used for all these challenges were only 16 bits long, and so you could pretty much brute force through the entire key pretty quickly. Lastly, this is all compounded by the fact that all these components were interconnected, and so if you could gain access to one of them, you could gain access to all of them, which makes security a big problem in cars right now. Now, what exactly was in our paper? Well, the authors of our paper did a comprehensive review of the security components of a car. They pretty much managed to hack a car using the various exploits described by previous researchers, but they had to add some other stuff so that they could sniff the packets to see what was being sent out and what packets meant what. Once they managed to perform these exploits, they then took over several key components in the car, including the brakes, the engine, the heating, the ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC. Some of these exploits worked while the car was moving as well, which makes this even more scary. Looking from left to right, you can see on the very left is the packet that was being sent out maliciously, and in the middle is the result that was observed. The manual override column describes the user being able to manually override the changes that is what was being made, and the at speed column describes that these results were being observed at speeds higher than 40 miles per hour. In some of these scenarios, the car was hoisted on a platform, while in others it was on a runway, and so you can see this described in the check mark at the very right of the column, tested on a runway. The next column, need to unlock, describes that the car's manufacturer's master key was needed to observe these results. As you can see, some of the exploits are quite harmless, such as turning on the windshield wipers, while others can be extremely dangerous, such as turning off brake lights and unlocking all the doors. Now, how exactly do we verify that all these exploits were performed? Well, the authors of this paper didn't upload any source code for security reasons, obviously, and so instead we have to rely on the images that they've sent out to us. You can see on the very left is some of their analysis tools they've used, and towards the second image, their actual setup is there pictured, where they used an AVR, Atmel AVR motherboard, and they used the CAN capture ECOM cable plugged into the OBD port. The third picture is the platform they hoisted up to perform some of their exploits, and the fourth picture, if you can see over there in the dashboard, it says pawned by CarShark. And so that's how they managed to prove to us that they've hacked the car completely. Other than the outcomes described in the previous slides, what were the other outcomes of this paper? Well, for one thing, a new tool was developed called CarShark, named after the popular packet sniffing tool Wireshark. This would sit on the CAN bus and sniff out all the packets and record them onto its tool so it could be used for further playback. Secondly, this whole exercise also revealed several internal computing designs of the car, and it also found several deviations from standards when implementing all these protocols. For one thing, the standards state that the component should reject the disabled CAN communications packet when it is unsafe to accept it and act on it, such as when the car is moving, but in reality the system accepted it. They also managed to update the car firmware while the car was moving, again deviating from the standards set out for the CAN bus protocol. Since the publishing of this paper, what have researchers been doing in this area to prevent some of these attacks? Well, we managed to categorize most of the research papers into 3 separate sections: modern vulnerabilities, the changing threat landscape, and building a database of vulnerabilities. For the modern vulnerabilities, one of the most prominent ones that has been coming up recently is wireless hacking. Nowadays, cars are connected to the internet, and so exploiting this fact, we can take over cars wirelessly. Secondly, other components could also be of concern, such as the Bluetooth, USB ports, CD players, and car-to-car communications. There have already been examples of where the implementation of Bluetooth has been pretty poor, and this causes some buffer overflows to happen in cars. Secondly, the threat landscape is changing. Future threats include the telematic systems of a car, installed components of a car by car-sharing companies, OBD, onboard diagnostics, OBD dongles, and third-party applications. Lastly, a lot of research has been focused on building a database of vulnerabilities so that car manufacturers can make sure that when they send out a car, there are no exploits that currently exist that have already been documented. Now, how relevant is all of this to us? Well, safety plays an important role for car manufacturers, for car owners, and for governments, and there are thousands of cars being sold every day. Often these cars stay out on the road for 10 years or more, so it's important that we start taking car safety seriously. On the right, you can see an image of Ford hiring a car safety specialist, and I think these jobs will only grow more in the future.
Hi, I'm Matt, and I'll be taking you through the second part of the presentation, starting with practical significance of the paper. So, how practical or significant were the findings in this paper? During the time of its release, it was one of the first research papers to have documented the actual exploitation of an automotive vehicle via the internal CAN network. This itself makes the paper fairly significant. The paper also further documents the degree of control and access that the research team could achieve through such exploitation and the resulting safety ramifications. However, despite this, security concerns in the industry remain somewhat skeptical, as the threat model conveyed in this paper is highly dependent upon prior physical access, possibly for an extended period of time. This made the attack vector seem more or less impractical and unrealistic, a view shared by the team in their newer research paper released that following year, which obviously pointed out that attackers requiring physical access could just as easily use less sophisticated means to tamper with the vehicle, such as cutting its brake lines or other physical damage. It was in this following paper, however, that the team legitimized some cases of this vector through use of indirect physical attacks. This method relied on obtaining physical access through a third party. 2 examples of this can be seen in the adapter mobile app attack and the servicing attack. The first example involves users such as tuners and other car enthusiasts that have plugged in a Bluetooth-enabled OBD2 adapter into the car's OBD2 port in order to gain access to the car engine's readings and diagnostics. This is usually accomplished via a mobile device app paired to the wireless adapter, which has direct access to the OBD2 port. The malicious vector here involves leveraging this connection by publishing malicious designed apps to the App Store, posing as a genuine car diagnostic application. The second example involves an attack on a car servicing site, such as a car dealership. It's not uncommon for service personnel to have laptops directly connected to a car via a CAN port or OBD2 port to diagnose or flash ECU firmware. Therefore, should an attacker compromise a dealership's internal computer network, they could gain indirect access to all vehicles being serviced. However, in comparison, these attacks too are more limited in regards to scale of users affected when compared with newer attack vectors. Newer attack vectors are comprised of short long-range wireless radio and can involve vulnerabilities in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, brand telematic services, and onboard computer applications. These newer vectors lead to a much more practical attack due to their more remote nature and higher scale of potential affected users. Although its significance, the paper does have a few weaknesses. It lacks a few key details in terms of clearly describing procedural details such as setup and configuration. It names the brand and models of the CAN to USB interface used, but it also mentions that it uses an Atmel chip dev board with need of some custom firmware. It does not describe the protocol used or the source of this firmware. The paper repeatedly mentions the use of custom written software, a program called CarShark, which they use to sniff, record, and inject packets used in all their CAN network attacks. The source code for CarShark software has not been made available, and although presently there are many tools such as CANutils in Linux that can read and generate packets for injection, the exact method of how the researchers approach this is unknown. The research team also performed their analysis on two 2009 model automobiles of the same make and model. It doesn't disclose any further information, stating that the vulnerabilities lay in the design of the automotive platform rather than the fault of any one manufacturer. Although this may be true, many papers since then have fully disclosed such details and have led to combined efforts to thoroughly document vulnerabilities. An example is the resulting lists of the most vulnerable cars reported, of which the 2014 Jeep Cherokee was the most hackable car in production at the time. Thus, although the paper is very extensive and detailed, even going as far as to list opcodes results for different vehicle operations, it lacks enough of the other details to be reproduced exactly. The team perhaps omitted these details intentionally for security reasons, but this makes their work hard to reproduce exactly. Overall, the paper's overarching goal is to discover the capabilities of an attacker after a vehicle is compromised, and exploration in this area. Therefore, taking everything into account, the paper's few deficiencies are not as significant when considering the paper had met its objectives. The paper was very novel at the time. While before the paper's release, most researchers have up until this time only pointed out and hypothesized potential vulnerabilities in the CAN bus protocol. It was only after the paper's release that there was research which documented the first actual exploitation of an automated vehicle via the internal CAN network. Using proper research methods and precautions, they were able to perform tests on both moving and stationary vehicles. The key aspects of the research revealed fundamentally that cars currently being used and sold had some serious vulnerabilities, and thus having cause for major concerns regarding automotive safety and security. The paper remains a foundational work in the field of automotive security and has been cited in hundreds of research papers and books, many of which have built upon its findings to further research more modern and remote attacks. It's also known for its inspiration in developing the more secure Avita protocols. Other than its novelty, the paper's other strengths include its comprehensive review of security components, looking into not just known exploit routes, but also delved into unconventional exploit routes such as flashing whole new firmware to systems. The research thoroughly explored all capabilities of a compromised vehicle in various different states and managed to accomplish these tasks through inexpensive means without advanced specialized equipment, and basically opened the field to exploration. The final strength of this paper lies in its relevance in modern-day society. Safety plays an important role for car manufacturers, car owners, and governments. People want to buy the safest car possible, and governments want to make sure that safe cars are being sold in any country. This paper sheds some new light on car safety and adds another area of concern for manufacturers, buyers, and governments. Where this paper can improve, however, is on the procedural details mentioned before. Since the paper has now been published for several years, the source code could have been made open source, or available via a repository for production and academic purposes. From a practical perspective, the exploits listed in this paper are quite unfeasible. All of these exploits require physical access to the car, and they also require the hacker to be extremely knowledgeable in the area of CAN bus security. Further technical papers have addressed this issue by presenting solutions for wireless exploitation. Lastly, the paper makes no effort to recommend any fixes. A discussion of how to possibly mitigate discovered threats would have been ideal. In conclusion, the paper's research was very novel at the time. It achieved its goals in exploring the capabilities of a compromised vehicle, although most of its exploration work relies on prior physical access, which can be impractical. And aside from lacking certain details that make reproducing the paper's results hard, it remains a pivotal piece of academic literature that is known for taking automotive security research in the right direction. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our presentation. Here are some references that we have mentioned throughout it. If you have any questions, Jay and myself will be answering on the Open Learning platform. See you then.